Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the Bulkley Valley Research Seminar Virtual Seminar Series. My name is Dawn Hansen and I'm the Executive Director of the Bulkley Valley Research Center. We're hosting this seminar today from the unceded traditional territory of the Gidimt'en clan of the Wet'suwet'en Nation in Northwest British Columbia. I'd like to acknowledge our funders who make our seminar series possible: Bulkley Valley Community Foundation, Bulkley Valley Credit Union, TD Friends of the Environment Fund, and Bulkley Valley Research Center members, individuals like you who support the center and help make our seminar series and research possible. We appreciate your support greatly. If you aren't a member of the center, I encourage you to become one. You can visit our website, bvcenter.ca, click on Get Involved, and you can learn more there. You're also welcome to reach out in an email or phone call to us anytime. We are recording today's seminar. You'll be able to find it, as well as recordings of our previous seminars, on our YouTube channel. Again, visit our website, bvcenter.ca, and click on Events and then Seminars, and you'll see upcoming seminars, as well as our YouTube channel link and more information there as well. It's a great pleasure today to have our Bulkley Valley Research Center Fire Research team presenting on developing wildfire resilience in northern BC forests. It's a great collaboration and they've been working incredibly hard along with partners to bring this to fruition. And our team is Evelyn Hamilton, Dr. Alana Clason, Dr. Kira Hoffman, Dr. Sam Coggins, and Dr. Phil Burton. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Evelyn, for introductions. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Dawn. Yes, so I'm Evelyn Hamilton, and a little bit about me. I started working for the research branch Forest Service back in the 80s, doing fire science, and then went on to manage the Ecology Earth Sciences program before I retired in 2010. I'm now the program lead for the BV Center's Fire Research Initiative. So next slide. Next slide, please, Dawn. So this is an overview of what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to provide a little bit of background to the project, and then the key scientists who Dawn has just introduced will give a brief talk about the work that they've done, share a few early results. Alana will talk about her post-fire carbon and wildlife and habitat and mountain whitebark pine work. Kira is going to talk about her work to understand historic fire activities in the north. Sam will discuss his remote sensing for burn severity work, and Phil will talk about the fire skips and refugium prospects for landscape level fuel breaks. And then I will summarize what we've heard and we can host questions. So next slide. So the premise for the work, the background on it is illustrated in these graphics here. We know that climate change in the upper part is predicted to worsen, and all three ingredients required for wildfire: fuel, ignition, and weather are expected to change in ways that will make global warming a triple threat to our forests. And we've seen already evidence of increasing global surface temperatures, as you can see down in this NOAA graphic, and the last year was recorded one of the highest temperature year on record. So this graphic, this triangle on the right-hand side, summarizes the thinking that Laurie Daniels has put forward on what the kind of changes that we're seeing and how they can have implications for the resilience of our forests to wildfire. So this is the idea, the concept, the hypothesis that we're investigating in our studies. We're looking at how the forests have changed, what the fire regimes have changed, look like, and how forest management may have shifted these factors. This work is being done with major funding and partnership with the BC and federal government, including major funding by the BC Wildfire Service, the Forest Carbon Initiative, and the Skeena region, and it's done in collaboration with Laurie Daniels from UBC and Phil Burton from UNBC. And there's also a number of specific topic-specific funders, which the key researchers will identify. So with that, we can move on to the next slide, and Alana will take it away.
Okay, I've unmuted and videoed. Can everybody hear me? Good. I'll assume yes. Okay, thanks everybody, and thanks Dawn for hosting us today at the Research Center Seminar Series. I am Alana Clason, and I'm an in-house researcher with the Bulk Research Center. I have a number of projects running right now, but I'm going to talk to you today about some work on how forests are recovering after wildfire in our region, and specifically looking at carbon and wildlife habitat. I want to acknowledge my funders, the main one being Forest Carbon Initiative, who has initiated this project, as well as a number of others that help flesh out the wildlife pieces. I do want to say thank you to Erica Louise and Anne-Marie Roberts in particular for collaborating with me on this project, as well as the larger project team, and making sure that this research is going to be effective in helping practices. And I want to give a special thank you to the technicians, Ingrid, Jocelyn, Malia, and Ian, who did all of the hard work of collecting the data this past summer in what was probably one of the wettest, buggiest, coldest, and probably a year with doing fieldwork during COVID. Lastly, I do have whitebark pine on this slide. I am doing research on the impacts of fire on whitebark pine ecosystems, but just don't have time to talk to it today. But I can give a plug that Sybil Hausler and I are giving a talk during the NRES colloquium series at UNBC on March 5th, and I'll be talking about the potential pros and cons of fire as far as whitebark is concerned. So if you could do the next slide there, Dawn. So what I want to talk to you today about is really to just give an overview of the project, the program that I'm working on here on post-fire recovery, and walk you through a little bit of the early stages of the data analysis and what we're seeing in terms of trends. But I really appreciate Evelyn setting up that context of why we're working on fire in this region. And I think it's really important when we look at the amount of area that fire touches in this area, we want to be able to understand how forests are going to recover and change over time. And we could look at those changes and what the forest looks like over time with a bunch of different lenses. So today I'm putting on a carbon lens and a moose browse lens, but you could also look at how forests recover in terms of timber for fuels, whether it's setting up for the next fire, stand structure if you're looking at biodiversity. So these are all concepts that are sort of integral to this research. So what this is really about is what we do after a fire. So in a lot of cases, when fire comes through, if it burns on managed forest lands, there's requirements to replant a timber crop. But we also do plant into the mature forest that burns. And the real question here is whether that planting is doing us any service in terms of reestablishing a timber crop or just a forest earlier to start the process of carbon sequestration, and whether that's something we want to keep doing into the future. So if you could go to the next slide, Dawn. So what this looks like is what we're really targeting is what's the difference in trajectories if we plant versus if we don't plant a forest after wildfire. And because we don't have long-term plots, 75-year-old permanent plots that we can follow and track over time, we've used a chronosequence approach. And so what that means is we look across the landscape for fire, for forests that burnt at different periods of time. And so we stretch this chronosequence back to the 1960s when fires came through, and forests were actually rehabbed after those a little bit later. And our chronosequence goes forward to 2015. Our main treatments that we were interested in this study was the time since fire, fire severity, because that can have a huge impact on vegetation response post-fire, and then obviously the planted, not planted treatment. I do want to say just quickly that we focus this research on music or thereabouts sites, and that's really important to think about moving forward because there are lots of other forest type out there that we didn't get to. Next slide, please. Okay, I keep saying we, but I definitely did not collect all the plot work this past summer. So this is Ian, Malia, and Jocelyn and Ingrid digging out their truck. And they managed to get to 21 fires across this region, sort of from Smithers to Prince George and south of Highway 16. The fires ranged from 1960 to 2015. And if you go to the next slide, Dawn. They managed to put in 75 plots. And so these plots are fairly intense. We want to collect a lot of data on all sorts of different pieces of the forest, and that's so that we can answer questions about carbon. There's lots of different pools of carbon, both in the live and the dead and in the soil. So we collected all of those pieces of data. We also wanted to ensure we understood what the impacts of the fire was in the ecosystem. So we measured a lot of fire metrics, which became really difficult as you move back in time, and especially on managed sands after fire, it's hard to see those fire signatures. And then we measured a lot of non-tree vegetation, so the other things that come back in order to understand the wildlife habitat piece. You can go to the next slide there, Dawn. Okay, so we are at the early stages of data analysis now and moving towards writing this up as a paper. So Jocelyn and Ingrid, who have stayed on as technicians throughout this winter, have done a great job of putting together some early graphs that we can look at today, just to give you guys a flavor of some of the trends. So what I'm showing you here is the live trees that have responded after fire. What we have is the big trees are on the right-hand side column, the little trees, so the regeneration is on the left side of this chart, and in the middle is, medium, we'll call them that. It's sort of an arbitrary size class distribution, but it gives you a little bit of a sense of the different live trees that are in these sites. Along the bottom is the time periods, and that's been chunked into some time periods just to make it a little bit easier to digest. All the different colors of the different species, and then we're looking at the different stems per hectare. Planted on top, not planted on the bottom. And Dawn, if you go to the next slide, what I just wanted to draw your attention to in this slide in particular is that a pretty obvious trend that's starting to come out is if you want to grow big trees faster, that planting looks to be a bit more effective at that. We don't have as many trees in that larger size class in the non-planted treatments. And then the next slide, Dawn. And then if we look at the regeneration, also quite a stark difference there. So we have a lot of small stems in the young post-fire sites in the not planted treatments as opposed to the planted treatments. So this just gives you a little bit of a sense of the statistical analyses that we're going to be pursuing in the next couple of months in order to try to understand these trajectories and to also understand the interactions with different components that we measured, covariates that we measured, such as fire severity. So if you go to the next slide, now we can look at dead wood. So coarse woody debris is the wood, the trees that fall down and are on the ground dead. And so these were measured obviously across all of the different sites. And what we have here is the volume of coarse woody debris separated into not planted on the bottom, planted on the top, and the different time periods along the x-axis. And I think that Ingrid put together, it shows a nice difference between those two treatments, planted versus not planted. And we certainly, this jives with what folks were seeing in the field, is that there's a lot more dead wood on the ground in the not planted treatments. So if you go to the last slide there, Dawn. Okay, a bit of a busier graph, but I just wanted to make sure to mention that we are continuing with looking at the wildlife habitat response as well. We're really fortunate that Jocelyn is actually interested in pursuing this as a master's, so we're going to be moving forward with another field season this coming summer and really delving deeper into these interactions. But what I wanted to show here is just that there is the available browse. So that's moose browse going from 0 to 3 meters in height, and of certain species that moose like to eat. That's the y-axis, and along the bottom on the left-hand side is fire severity. And really just to draw your eyes to the fact that the not planted, which is that pinky red color, we get quite a range of response in browse, and likely quite a bit higher in the non-planted treatment compared to the planted. And that's probably expected because it's those low severity burns where rhizomes survive and you have the resprouting of shrubs post-fire. So we'll be looking more into those interactions. And then with the time period, what we're really looking to see with the moose browse is that we do in fact get a flush of browse post-fire, maybe 10 to 30 years. And whether or not that planting, so the blue in this case, is pulling that down at all, because that's what we need to know, is if the planting treatment is affecting the browse for moose. And with that, I think I'm good to pass it over to Kira.
Okay, I hope everyone can hear me. Thanks, Alana. So my name's Kira Hoffman, and I am a jointly appointed postdoctoral researcher with the University of British Columbia, working with Laurie Daniels, as well as the Bulkley Valley Research Center. And I'd just like to acknowledge that this is under a MyTax Elevate Fellowship, as well as an early career grant from National Geographic. And my role in this project is trying to fill in gaps about historic fire regime variability. So you can go to the next slide there, Don.
Kira, you're a bit quiet.
Okay, bit quiet. Okay, I'll try and put my face as close as I can. Can people hear me okay?
Still a bit quiet. I can hear you, but
okay. I'll often have this issue. Okay, so in 2017 and 2018, most people who live in British Columbia were pretty familiar with the very large fires that came through this area. And so my area of research is generally from Quesnel to Bob Quinn area. And kind of people started asking questions about, what is unprecedented fire behavior in this region? Subboreal spruce and pine forests have some of the largest wildfires in the world. So this area hosts very large fires outside of the boreal. And, were these fires unprecedented in terms of behavior and severity? And if so, then what contributing factors played a big role in that? And so it's trying to understand it within the context of this historical fire activity. And so we know that there's a huge amount of fuel accumulation because of fire suppression, as well as we have, infestations from bark beetle, from mountain pine beetle. And so we're moving into this era of mega fires where the fires we're starting to see here are very large, so over 10,000 hectares, and really impacting communities and livelihoods here. So trying to put it in context, and you can move into actually, I'll just if you want to go back for a second there, Don, I just wanted to say that the photo on the right is a fire-scarred spruce tree. And it's actually pretty hard to find these. So this one's scarred twice. And so this is telling us that a low or mixed severity fire came through this forest not once, but twice. And it's still here. And so what's kind of happening, this can provide an idea about the legacy effect of fires. And so just giving you an impression that, okay, low severity fire happened here, in 1930 and in 1950. And then we're not seeing really any fire recording after that. And so these fire scars can provide snapshots about what's happening on the landscape. But you can move on to the next slide, Don. Some of the issues with fire scars here is that there's not very many of them, because when we have those really big fires, they come in and they erase the effects. And so we don't have those legacies or those narratives describing what the fire patterns were in the past. And so we need to rely on multiple lines of evidence in order to reconstruct fire activity. And especially, there's a huge gap in knowledge with understanding Indigenous fire stewardship, which was really common Looking back through historic images, you can see large south-facing slopes that were all cleared that are now filled with trees. And so it can give us an idea when we kind of, fire scars give us the snapshot of about a very small area. But if we want to look at the landscape scale, we need to bring in remote sensing as well as historic imagery surveys. And so if you move to the next slide there, Dawn. Most people probably familiar with Melco Lookout. It's in Smithers. This is a great and valuable data set on how to document landscape change. So it was originally a fire lookout, and about every 15 years, 8 images were taken in all the cardinal directions so that the person who was in charge of the fire lookout could be really familiar with landscape change. And so it creates this really rich data set. And right away you can see, like, okay, the glacier is a lot smaller in 2020. There's a lot less snow, even though they're taken at the same time. But most importantly for me is you see that there is a fire right in the foreground, and then we see trees filling up. And so these images can just provide an idea about what landscapes used to look like. And a lot of them are actually kind of before the era of large scale fire suppression. And these images are housed in the Royal BC Museum in the archives, as well as the Library and Archives Canada. And a lot of them are glass plated images that have never been seen by the public. So next slide. So I'm working in collaboration with the Mountain Legacy Project as well out of University of Victoria. And they're trying to do 100-year resurveys in the Rocky Mountain Trench, and as well as some of the fire lookouts in Alberta. So this is Carbondale Hill, and you can see the top image, the whole valley is actually burned. And if you were to go there in 2015, which is the lower image, you can see that that fire wouldn't have necessarily been obvious on the landscape. And so these images, when they're taken in repeat succession, can actually give us a really good idea about landscape change. And these are also over really large areas. So some of these survey points are the premise for the 1 to 250,000 maps. So next slide, Dawn. So this summer, I'm really hoping to have a better field season than last summer. It rained almost every day here, and taking repeat photographs wasn't a great idea. I was able to make it to 10 fire lookouts, but I'm hoping to take trips into 28 fire lookouts to take those repeat images. And there's about 180 fire lookouts in British Columbia. And they all have these really rich data sets attached to them. A lot of them are dismantled and they're hard to find, and it's a crazy bushwhack to get in there. Sometimes when you get there, there's totally, the vision or the view is totally obscured by trees. And so still using new image analysis and toolkits, you can actually go pixel by pixel comparing these historic images to the contemporary images and figuring out exactly, what was covered in forest or water that no longer is. And you can take this qualitative image and shift it into a quantitative data set. Places like Tweedsmuir Provincial Park are very rich in these historic photographs. We have images there from 1905, and they provide a great example of a place that has very little logging, a lot of fire, and then probably really importantly is a really rich history of Indigenous fire management in the area. So with that, I think I'll just shift it over to Sam Coggins' work on remote sensing.
Hi, folks. So I'm Sam Coggins. I'm an independent researcher with the Bulkley Valley Research Centre. I'm also an adjunct prof at UBC in the Faculty of Forestry. So I thought I would talk today about some of the remote sensing work I've been doing. And Dawn, if you want to flick forward to the next slide. Really what I'm going to be talking about here is how I use some remote sensing work to look at burn severity over the summer. My analysis is all underway. And so this is kind of a lead in to some of the stuff that Phil's going to be talking about after I go. So just to kind of go over some remote sensing basics, you know, it's a really efficient way of looking at very large areas without having to travel into the bush too much with kind of minimal ground verification. I'll get more into kind of some of the ground verification work that I was doing last summer, just in a couple of slides. So certainly since I was in grad school, there's been lots of advances in the availability of remote sensing data. So there's lots of catalogs out there that are now available for, you know, that provide all this imagery free of charge. The other thing is that a lot of these places are also now post-processing the imagery, so they're ready to use, ready to go, and you don't need to get into some of that more complicated atmospheric corrections and that kind of thing. The two sources that I use for my work here, Landsat, so that's been in existence since 1972, and it's got this almost continuous archive. So just as Kira was saying there, that you can build up these time steps of imagery. Landsat, we can go back to 1972 and take a look at how the forest has changed. And certainly since I was in grad school, new satellites have come along. We've got increased spatial, spectral, and temporal resolutions. And in this case, so you can see in the image that I've got here on the slide, you've got Sentinel true color imagery, and that is, you know, we're looking at 20-meter pixels, so you can see stuff on the ground 20 meters by 20 meters. So it's, you know, lots of advances. And now I'm going to talk just about how we can use some of this imagery to examine burn severity. So next slide there, Dawn. So in this case, burn severity refers to this magnitude of change by fires on the landscape. And specifically, I wanted to talk about the normalized burn ratio. So as you can see on the slide here, 73% accuracy in predictions. And the way that it works is that we have very high reflectance of healthy vegetation in the near infrared. So we're using near infrared and shortwave infrared. And the example I've got here is with Sentinel. So, so high reflectance in the near infrared and low reflectance in the shortwave infrared. And then the opposite of that is true in areas that have been killed off by fire. So the first line that you see there, the first line of equation that you see there, that's one image. So that's just looking at the one time step. So what we want to do is look at the difference in forest. So you get a before image, a before fire image of the forest, and you get a post fire image of the forest. So after a fire has gone through, and take the two away from each other, and that tells you what the difference between the two is and helps you explain some of that story. And on the next slide, I've got one of these images that I've calculated from the summer. So this is the Burton mountain fire. You can see the kind of the green area around the fire. That's your healthy forest. And then you've got the red and the oranges and the yellows that represent the fires that have, or the burn severities that have become increasingly severe, with that kind of purple color there representing the high severity burns. So we can tell from that which areas burned hottest. And then we can also start looking at gathering other information from imagery like this. So we can bring things like results data. So what's happened in the forest beforehand and how it has influenced how that burn has affected the landscape. And you can see kind of the greens within the fire here mostly go back to cut blocks. you can see that geometric shape of a cut block. There's other things in here, like we can mask out things like water and other influences on the landscape, just to provide a really good picture of what's happened in that fire before. And things like beetle infestations that have gone through, how do they influence what's been going on, and do these high burn severities correlate with say a mountain pine beetle infestation. So if we go on to the next slide, that's a real quick overview of the remote sensing side of things. And then what I was doing for for a bit of time last summer. And when I say I mean I had a team of folks just like Alana. So Sheena Briggs from the research center was there, and Ingrid and Jocelyn, and I believe I saw Lindsay King's name in the list of participants. So the 5 of us and 1 or 2 others went out there and were collecting data in September and October last year. So there's methodology out there that really that lets us examine this burn severity on the ground. So composite burn index plots are visual examinations of several strata within a forest. And looking at how the forest has been impacted, and then being able to compare that back to burn severity estimates from satellite information. And there's quite a few studies that have done this in other areas. Now last year we went out. These plots are pretty quick and easy to put in. So we're looking at after some calibration by the field crew, we're looking at half an hour to 3/4 of an hour of time to collect the data. And it really is a question of going in and making those visual estimates of characteristics in a like a 30-meter diameter plot. And we, as you can see from the photos there, we concentrated on
sound that's not working?
We concentrated on 4 fires. So we collected information across Nadina Lake Fire, Verdun Mountain, Shovel Lake, and then LeJac was a 2019 fire, really small fire in comparison to the other 3. So yeah, I think and then in this one, what we really wanted to get was also the difference between Conifer leading versus Aspen leading stands. So, and then also examine the differences in burn severity. So we ended up with four categories that we were looking at. So we had Aspen high severity, Aspen moderate severity, and then the same in the Conifer stands. And then we also added in a category for unburned. So as we're driving through the forest, looking for our plots in our GPS, and we notice an area that hasn't been burned, we were jumping out of the truck and heading into the bush to go and put in a plot in the unburned and recording that GPS location. And then we can compare that back to our remote sensing imagery. So if we can move on to the next slide there, Dawn. These couple of photos here of plots we put in. So both of them in Nadina Lake. So you can see the Conifer high severity and see the real difference between how that forest is recovering in Conifer versus Aspen. So in the Conifer, and this was a pretty standard kind of scenario for when we got into these plots. The conifers had been conifer plots in high severity and in moderate had pretty much been annihilated. It was it was night and day difference from the Aspen plots. And so here we got an Aspen high severity. So the high severity came from burned area reflectance classifications that were done by the province, and those classifications are all based on satellite imagery. So we use those to kind of filter where we were going to go, and the categories that we looked at. And I will get around to comparing our, and I think Phil is going to talk about this in a minute, about comparing our field data to these classifications plus to the imagery that I talked about at the beginning of my slides there. So yeah, I think that's roughly everything I wanted to say, and look forward to hearing some questions from everybody later on. Thanks.
Thank you, Sam, and hello, everybody. My name is Phil Burton. I'm a professor in ecosystem science and management at UNBC, based at their Terrace campus. I've been with UNBC for, I guess, about 9 years now, another 9 years before that with the Canadian Forest Service in Prince George. And before that, I was an independent researcher in the Bulkley Valley. So this project and this team is an opportunity to bring that entire legacy together here. And I'm going to describe some of the research that was introduced by Sam with a focus on a particular phenomenon that he referred to. And that is the observation that a lot of cut blocks seemed to not have burned, as you can see in a couple of these images here. And off the bat, I really have to thank Jim Pojar and Larry McCulloch for bringing this to my attention. And since they pointed it out, I've been like a dog with the bone and trying to figure it out, because in many ways it's contrary to the dogma out there that fully stocked single species pine plantations are expected to be more susceptible to disturbances such as fire and insects. Yet here we have apparent visual evidence that wildfires that went through under extreme fire weather conditions did in fact not crown out in these stands. So I set out starting about a year and a half ago to investigate whether this was a real pattern, is this statistically valid, and if so, why? And cutting to the bottom line, we still don't really know why and how, and research will continue in the coming year. Next slide, please, Don. To start with, we looked at what were the mega fires that happened in 2017 and 2018. It turned out there were 31 of them that were bigger than 10,000 hectares. And if we focus just those within our central interior fire regime, we noticed that 20 of them were available and 14 of those had logging. So we started with the burn severity maps made by the province, as Sam referred to, in which they did standard classification of unburned, low, moderate, and high severity burning, as indicated in the upper right of the map there, in which you see sort of yellow, orange, and red categories denoting burn classes. We overlaid that with the pre-fire VRI, the pre-fire vegetation resource inventory that shows the dominant forest cover, and also a little bit of the disturbance history. So that included the age class of the forest and when it was logged or otherwise burned or disturbed. So we were particularly focused, for example, on the observation that it was these age class 2 plantations, cut blocks logged 20 to 40 years ago, that seem to be burning less frequently. So the next slide, please. A quick chi-square analysis, just looking to see whether this was more or less than could be expected by chance, was conducted. The first analysis was done on a pixel by pixel basis. So these 30 meter square pixels from Landsat imagery. And because of adjacency issues, the analysis had to be adjusted for spatial autocorrelation. And even with all of those adjustments, we found that in fact, half of the fires we investigated did show a significantly lower rate of burning in age class 2 cut blocks. But if you look at the magnitude of that difference, this is in terms of area now, it really was relatively low, 5% or less, although sometimes up to 16%. So highly significant, but statistically, but maybe not so significant on the ground, management-wise or ecologically. Next slide, please. So we're following up on that analysis with a different approach. And here I'm thanking Sam and Alana for helping out with preparing this information. Instead of doing it pixel by pixel, we're doing a polygon-based approach and looking a little bit more into the deep history. And Kira was very helpful in pulling together some of the site history too. Here we have to dig into what's known as the results database maintained by the province, in which it indicates whether blocks were planted. That has other details such as planting density, whether it was spaced or thinned. And most important for my next hypothesis, whether it was site prepared or not. Because talking to practitioners on the ground, it was a general impression that, oh yeah, back in the 80s, they used to do slash burning, and the cut blocks that are surviving the fire now were the ones that were slash burned. So we investigated that, that option and found that yes, in fact, it was true. If it was subject to site prep by fire, it did have a significantly less burn severity. Overall now, a weighted burn severity by the polygon, not just a yes/no option as in the previous analysis. But in addition, any site preparation, mechanical site preparation also resulted in reduced burn severity in these managed stands, in these cut blocks, especially those from 21 to 40 years ago. Not so significant in the ones older than that, not so significant in the ones younger than that. Interestingly enough, the site preparation seems to have really fallen off in the last 20 years. Licensees count more on rapid planting rather than spending the money on site prep, it seems. Next slide, please. So we're still going to follow through with other issues there in terms of trying to explain the variation in burn severity around those plantations. But we realize that we now have a data set in which we can answer a whole bunch of other questions, such as the effect of mountain pine beetle history and of different fuel types. One of the other questions I'd like to pursue yet is whether really old stands have been repeatedly avoided fire and will do so in modern times, just as they had for the last 100 or 200 years. But one of the most immediate questions was whether in fact there was a fire severity reduction in broadleaf leading stands. And so we tested that category within the I think it was it all 20 fires or 19 fires, I think, had some broadleaf component. And in fact, I think it was 5 of them had significantly less burning, just in terms of burned, unburned at that pixel level. Next slide, please. But the contrary was also true, and this was very confounding. Some broadleaf stands in some fires seemed to burn more than expected, only by chance. So we have yet to redo this analysis on a polygon basis with weighted burn severity metrics, but this also required further investigation. And our hypothesis here relates to the observations that Sam showed you in that side-by-side pictorial, and that is that for any level of satellite-derived burn severity, that is how much of the green material has gone up in smoke, is in fact the ecological impact considerably different. And that's the basis for then now evaluating the burn severity plots that he put in. Next slide, please. And we found that two factors here. Sorry, I guess I skipped a step here. In general, from our Chisquare analysis of fire skips, that is those areas that were burned or not burned, never mind the burn severity class, we found that in fact that there was a shift in terms of those broadleaf polygons that had no logging history, that there was in general a shift to lower and unburned severity classes compared to conifer stands. So perhaps more so than contributing to fire skips, the presence of broadleaves resulted in lower burn severity. Next slide, please. That's where we bring in the results of the composite burn index plots, which showed that for any given mapped level of severity, here just looking at medium and high, the ecological impact is clearly lower in the broadleaf leading stands, suggesting that really in burn severity mapping, and this is done as a matter of course by the province now, as well as by researchers, we probably should have different thresholds, different areas, low, moderate, or highly severely burned. And I'm not sure if I have another slide or not. Next slide. And it's back to Evelyn. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all. So I'm just going to briefly wrap up with a summary. So from Kira's work, you can see we're looking to look back in time and see how our landscape has changed over time. Shows what we're learning about recovery of these forests after they've been burned by wildfire back to the fires that were back in the 60s, and what it means for reforestation and browse and some other values. And Sam and Phil's work together looking at these more recent fires and what are we seeing in terms of the implications of recent forest management choices in terms of the extent to which they burned, and looking at issues like the matter whether they're aspen and broadleaf dominated or pine, and it seems early indications is that there are some differences there which may provide some potential for some landscape level management for field breaks. So with that, we're going to open it up for questions. Two options: you can ask a question through the chat box by just writing it in there, or if you want to raise your hand and answer a question, Dawn will field those. If you have a particular person you want to direct it to, maybe just indicate that in the chat or when you raise your hand. Otherwise, I'll guess at who might want to best answer that.
Great.
So with that, we can open it up.
Okay. Thanks, Evelyn.